There is a book in Dublin that refuses to say who made it. It sits at Trinity College, catalogued as Manuscript 58. 680 pages of calfskin, painted by hand more than 1,000 years ago. Nobody signed it. Nobody dated it. Nobody wrote down where the work was done. Tonight you are going to sit with that silence for a while. Get comfortable, however you happen to be lying. Lamp low, the room as warm as you want it. We are going to circle one question all night, and it is a plain one. Nobody knows who made the Book of Kells. Nobody knows where. Nobody knows why several of its pages were left unfinished. Those 3 gaps are the shape of your night. We start with the object itself tonight, because the object is the only real evidence. Then we cross to a small island off the west coast of Scotland, and you go into the room where books like this were made. At the end of the night we come back to those 3 questions. Keep them somewhere you can reach all night. The Book of Kells is a gospel book, made to be looked at as much as read. 340 folios survive, that is 680 pages, counting both sides of every leaf. Scholars think it originally ran to about 370 folios, so roughly 30 are gone. We do not know when they went, or where, or whether anyone noticed. Hold one page in your mind at its real size, about 330 millimeters tall and 250 across. That is a little larger than the sheet of paper you would print a letter on. The written area inside that is smaller, about 250 by 170 millimeters. 16 to 18 lines of text on a page. Not many words at all. A great deal of room around them. The pages are calf vellum, skin, worked down until it took ink and held it. If you ran a finger across a blank margin, you would feel 2 different surfaces on the same leaf. One face carried hair, the other faced inward. The hair side is faintly darker and takes ink differently, and the scribes arranged their pages so that like faced like. The text is Latin, and mostly the Vulgate, the standard translation of the Western Church. But not only that, passages in it come from the older Latin versions that the Vulgate replaced, the Vetus Latina. So it is not a clean copy of one thing. Whoever made it worked from more than one source, or from a copy that already mixed them. That tells you something about the library behind it, but it does not tell you where the library was. Now the strangeness. Not one line anywhere in the book says who made it. No name, no place, no year. Books of this rank normally carry that information somewhere, usually at the end, in a note called a colophon. The Lindisfarne Gospels have one, added about the year 970, naming 4 men. 4 men named for one book. The Book of Kells names nobody at all. Wherever you are right now, you are somewhere specific. Someone is hearing this at 11:30 at night, with the heating ticking in the wall. Someone else has it on at 7 in the morning, on a bus, in a city where it is already light. Someone is working a night shift with an empty building around them. All of you are in the same room tonight, and this is the room. Now back to the book. If you stand in front of it today, the first surprise is the colour. Yellow, red, green, black, and a purple that still reads as purple. It has not gone brown. The second surprise is the density. Letters open into spirals. Spirals open into animals. A dog runs along the base of a line of text for no reason anyone can name. There are faces hidden in the initials, and cats, and 2 men pulling each other's beards. There is a second absence, and we only touch it tonight. Several pages in the book were never finished. The decoration was drawn out in outline, ready to be coloured, and the colour never arrived. The empty shapes are still there. No agreed explanation exists for this. Not one. We will stand over those pages properly later in the night and look at what people have argued. So hold 3 questions. We do not know who made this book. We do not know where it was made. We do not know why parts of it stop. Everything tonight hangs off those three. Carry them with you through all of it. The rest of the evidence is circumstantial, and it is fascinating, and it never quite closes. The name is worth pausing on too. We call it the Book of Kells because of where it was kept, not where it was made. Kells is a town in County Meath, inland, northwest of Dublin. The book was certainly there by the early 11th century. Whether it was made there is a separate question, and nobody has settled it either way. Come back to that mixed text, because it matters more than it sounds. A scribe copying a gospel book copies from an exemplar in front of him. If the finished book mixes two Latin traditions, then either the exemplar was mixed already, or more than one book lay open on the desk. Both possibilities mean a working library. Somebody, somewhere, had shelves. Those shelves are gone, and so is everything that stood on them. Think about the hours involved. Nobody timed the original work, and nobody now can. But the arithmetic only runs one way. A single decorated page of that complexity is not an afternoon. Multiply it across the decorated pages and you are into years, for several people at once, in a place that had to feed them. A book like this is an economic decision as much as a devotional one. Somebody paid for the calves. The first time the book appears certainly in the historical record is the year 1007. The Annals of Ulster record a theft of the great Gospel of Columcille, which they call the chief relic of the Western world. It was taken at night from the western sacristy of the great stone church at St Anna's. St Anna's is Kells. The thief wanted the wrought shrine, the worked metal cover, and not the pages inside it. It was found again after 2 months and 20 nights. Count that out. Roughly 80 days in which the greatest book in Ireland was missing. It turned up buried under a sod, with the gold stripped off it. The pages survived, the cover did not, and has never been found. Whatever the thief thought he had taken, he threw away the part we would now call priceless, and kept the wrapping. Put your own hands on that gold, in the dark, in a wet field. Notice what that entry does not say. It does not say who wrote the book. It calls it the Gospel of Columcille, which is a claim about holiness and ownership, not about authorship. By the year 1007 the book was already old, already famous, and already anonymous. The men writing the annals did not know either. The silence starts very early. There is one more absence worth naming. No letter, no inventory, no chronicle from the time of its making describes the book being made. Nothing survives to say that a great gospel is being written here this year. The first certain word about it is a theft, and that theft is centuries late. The book arrives in history already finished and already old. The book stayed at Kells for a long time, until 1654, when it was moved to Dublin for safety during Cromwell's occupation of Ireland. Cavalry had been quartered in the church there. 7 years later, in 1661, a bishop named Henry Jones presented it to Trinity College, Dublin. It has been in that one institution ever since, more than 360 years. By the middle of the 20th century, the leaves had begun to come loose. The binding could no longer hold them together. In 1953, a binder named Roger Powell took the whole book apart and rebound it. He made it 4 volumes, one for each gospel. That is the form it exists in today. Picture being the person who unpicks the binding of the Book of Kells. Your hands, that book, that particular morning. Now put yourself at the other end of the story, at the desk instead of the case. Cold, first of all. Timber or stone walls, no glass in the window opening, morning light coming in flat and grey. What you would smell is lamp smoke, damp wool, and the faint sourness of prepared skins. Your fingers would be stiff for the first hour. Your back would already ache from the angle of the board. Here is what makes the anonymity hard to shrug off. Anonymity is common enough in ordinary medieval work, and a working copy of the Psalms names nobody. But this is not ordinary work. This is the most heavily decorated gospel book to survive from early medieval Europe. Several people gave years of their lives to it, and not one of them left a name. Who sat down and did that? And why does the book not say? We can measure the object all day. 340 folios, 16 to 18 lines to the page. We can date the theft to 1007 and the move to Dublin to 1654. What we cannot do is put a person in the chair for you. In every account we have, the chair is empty, so we go looking for the room instead. If the book will not name a maker, then perhaps the work itself will name a place. The tradition, the annals, and the saint whose name is attached to the book all point the same direction. Not to Dublin, not even, at first, to Kells. They point north and west, out past the Irish coast, to a small island off the west coast of Scotland. Grass, rock and sand, with the sound of water on every side of it. In the year 563 a man came ashore there with a handful of companions. Everything we are chasing tonight begins with him, or is said to begin with him. Those are not the same statement, and we will keep the difference in view. The island is Iona, and it is small, about 5 kilometres from end to end, lying off the southwest tip of Mull, in the Inner Hebrides. You could walk its length in a morning. On a clear day the mountains of Mull stand up across the sound. Most days there is weather coming in off the Atlantic, and west of the island there is nothing but open water. An island sounds like a retreat. In the 6th century it was very nearly the opposite. The sea was the road. A boat could reach Iona from the Irish coast in a day or two with the right wind. From there it could carry on north to the Pictish country, and out through the Western Isles. Travel overland through that landscape was slow and punishing. Water was fast. Iona was not cut off. Iona was connected. In the year 563 a man named Columba came there from Ireland. In Irish his name is Colum Cille. He brought a small group of companions with him. He founded a monastery on the island, and he stayed. He died there in the year 597, 34 years after he landed. Those two dates frame everything that follows. Why he left Ireland at all is told in several ways, and the versions do not agree. Later accounts turn it into penance, after a quarrel that hardened into a battle. Earlier material is vaguer and less dramatic. We do not know why he sailed. We know that he sailed, with a small company, and that the year handed down is 563. Set aside the abbey that visitors photograph today. That is medieval stone, centuries later than Columba. His monastery was nothing like it. It was earthwork, timber and thatch, and it would have looked more like a farm than a church. If you walked into it in the year 580, you would smell wood smoke drifting off the huts. You would smell cattle in the pens. You would hear the sea the whole time. The boundary was a bank and a ditch, called a vallum, cut around the site to divide holy ground from ordinary ground. Inside it stood a church of oak with a thatched roof, and small huts for the monks to sleep and work in. Part of that comes from excavation of the bank itself, and part of it is inference from other Irish sites of the same period. It is fair to say we are reconstructing here, not observing. How many people lived there we cannot say with any confidence. A community of that kind needed farmers, herdsmen, boatmen and cooks long before it needed a single scribe. Someone had to milk. Someone had to cut turf and dry it and carry it in. The men who painted were fed by men who did not paint, and we have no names for either group. At night out there, the sound never stops. Wind first, then the sea underneath the wind, then animals shifting in the dark. There would be no light for miles except what burned inside the buildings. The dark out there was quiet in a way you have probably never heard. If you were lying in one of those huts in the year 600, your world would be about 5 kilometres across. Almost all of it would reach you as noise. Almost everything we are told about Columba comes from one book, The Life of Columba, written by Adomnan, a later abbot of Iona. He wrote it probably between the years 697 and 700. Do the subtraction with me. That is a full century after Columba died, and it is a saint's life written to demonstrate holiness, not a report written to record facts. That does not make it worthless, and nobody serious treats it that way. Adomnan knew the island. He walked the same ground and used older written sources that no longer survive. But his subject calms storms and sees events happening far away. You cannot lift the ordinary details out of a text like that and trust them at face value. You can note them, weigh them, and keep asking what they are doing there. What Adomnan does hand us is furniture. He mentions writing tablets, he mentions pens and styluses and the horn that held the ink. These are not details a later writer invents. They are the background noise of a place where writing happened every day. He is not describing a scriptorium for our benefit. He is telling stories in which the equipment simply happens to be lying about. He also puts Columba in one particular spot. There is a rocky knoll inside the monastery enclosure, low, not much taller than a house. It is called Tor an Abba, the mound of the abbot. Adomnan places Columba writing in a hut up on that knoll, looking east across the sound toward the mountains of Mull. That is a very specific place for a story to attach itself to. Stand up there for a moment. The wind does not stop on that knoll, and you would keep your back to it. Below you are the huts, the church, the smoke bending sideways. In front of you is water, then the hills of Mull, then whatever the weather is doing that hour. Across your knees would be a board, and on the board a page. In 1957, an archaeologist named Charles Thomas dug that knoll. He found the remains of a small structure on top of it. Along the tops of the walls he found charcoal. The charcoal was the burnt remains of hazel stakes, the uprights that had once held a roof up. Something small had stood on the mound, and something small had burned there. Picture the trench, and your own knees in the wet grass beside it. Then the story does something close to comic. Radiocarbon dating was not usable for him in 1957, not at that scale, and not on those samples. So the charcoal went into storage to wait for the science to catch up. And then it was lost. Not destroyed. Lost. Boxes moved. People retired. Decades went by. The samples ended up in a garage in Cornwall. They were found again. A team led by Ewan Campbell and Adrian Maldonado at the University of Glasgow tracked the material down and had it dated. That happened in 2017. 60 years after the trowel came out of the ground, the charcoal finally gave up its date. The hazel came back at somewhere between about 540 and 650. Sit with that range for a second. Columba died in the year 597. The hut on the knoll was standing inside that window. It was there during his lifetime. That is not proof that he sat in it, and no careful archaeologist would claim so. But the building Adomnan describes turns out to have been a real building, in the right place, in the right years. That is as close as archaeology has come to the desk. A burnt ring of hazel stakes on a small hill, dated by a laboratory 60 years late, on an island 5 kilometres long. Everything else we say about writing in that century is inference from books made elsewhere. This is a hole in the ground with a date attached. When your main source was written 100 years after the fact, a hole like that matters. Be clear about what has not been found, because nobody has uncovered a workshop on Iona. No bench, no desk, no rack of finished volumes, no stack of blank leaves. What was found is one small burnt building with a date on it. It stands on the exact knoll where a text from around the year 700 says the abbot went to write. That is a coincidence of place and period and nothing more. It is also the best coincidence anybody has produced. Hold on to it, because you will not be handed a better one tonight. That thinness is the general condition of Iona, where almost nothing survives directly. No library, no shelf list, no manuscript with the island's name written into it. The early buildings burned or rotted away. The metalwork went. What we have is a bank of earth, a burnt hut, a saint's life written a century later, and a tradition. Out of that, people argue about the greatest book of the early Middle Ages. Tradition credits Columba with an enormous amount of copying. The figures usually attached to it are large and unverifiable, and we will leave them there. The same tradition says he was copying when he died, that he stopped part way down a page and another hand finished it. Take that for what it is. It is a story a community told about its founder, and a story is not evidence. The story is still worth something, in a sideways sort of way. Communities tell stories about the things they value most. A monastery that told itself its founder died with a pen in his hand was a monastery that took copying very seriously indeed. Iona made books. On that much, nobody actually disagrees. Whatever you decide about the man himself, that part holds. One object survives that gets attached to all of this. It is called the Cathach, and it is a psalter, a book of psalms. It is held now by the Royal Irish Academy in Dublin, and it is the oldest surviving Irish manuscript we have. Tradition associates it directly with Columba, and it has often been dated to the late 6th century, which would place it inside his lifetime. Paleographers now frequently prefer the early 7th century, which would put it after his death, in the generation that came next. The disagreement is not settled, and we are not going to settle it tonight. For our purposes, the attribution matters less than the object itself. Set the two books side by side in your head. Look hard at the Cathach, and then look at the Book of Kells. The Cathach is plain. Its decoration is mostly one idea, repeated. The first letter of a psalm is made larger than the rest and given a rim of dots. The letters after it shrink back to ordinary size across a line or two. That is very nearly all of it. No full pages of colour, no animals swallowing their own tails, no cats in the margins. Between those two books lie roughly 2 centuries. In that time the craft went from a scribe ringing an initial with red dots to whole pages where the text almost disappears into the ornament. That is not a small change. That is a workshop tradition growing, teaching itself and handing itself down through generations of men who sat in the same seats. Somebody taught somebody. We know almost none of their names. That is the gap you keep walking back into tonight. That brings us back to where we started, because Iona is the strongest candidate anyone has for where the Book of Kells was begun. It is not a certainty. Arguments have placed the work in Ireland, in Scotland, and in both at different stages of the job. The book itself does not settle any of it. The book says nothing. That is the whole problem, and it will still be the problem when you reach the end of the night. So we come at it from the other side, and instead of asking who, we ask how. What did a person actually have to do, in a timber hut on a wet island, before a single letter could exist on a page? The answer starts a long way from the pen, and further back than you would expect. It starts outdoors, in a field, with a calf. Before anybody could write one word, somebody had to turn an animal into a page. That work was filthy. It stank, and it took weeks, and it was done in a shed set downwind of everywhere people slept. You would have smelled that shed long before you saw it. The men who did it are not the men whose names we might have hoped to recover, and a book the size of the one in Dublin needed a herd. Before anyone could write a letter, somebody had to turn an animal into a page. So start with the animal. A calf is born on the monastery's land, grazes there, and dies there. Its skin comes off in one piece. That skin is the raw material of every page in the Book of Kells. It is not paper, because paper had not yet reached the West in any quantity. It is not leather either. Leather is tanned, and parchment is never tanned. Parchment is skin, cleaned and stretched and dried under tension until it stops being skin. Vellum is the word usually kept for calfskin, and the Book of Kells is written on high-quality calf vellum. You are still here, and the hour has turned. This is the part of the night where the work stops being holy and becomes physical. Put your hands into it with me. The first step is washing, in cold running water where there is a stream to use. Then the skin goes into a bath of slaked lime, which is calcium hydroxide, quicklime with water added to it. That bath is strongly alkaline. It sits at around 12 to 13 on the pH scale, closer to oven cleaner than to soap. It would take the skin off your fingers in an afternoon. The hide stays in it for 8 to 14 days, and somebody stirs the vat every day. That job belonged to a person. Nobody wrote his name down. Every day, for 2 weeks, in a shed that smelled of lime and wet hide. The smell is the first thing you would notice, and the last thing you would forget. The lime is doing 2 things at once. It attacks the hair roots and the epidermis, loosening everything that anchors hair into skin. At the same time, it swells the collagen in the dermis, the thick fibrous layer underneath. That layer is the part that becomes your page. Nothing here is tanning. Tanning locks chemicals permanently into the fibrae and gives you leather, which is why a leather boot survives rain. Parchment never gets that. Its collagen stays bare, and it still answers to damp air 1,200 years later. After 8 to 14 days, the skin comes out of the vat heavy with water. It is drained, then laid hair side up over a curved wooden beam. The hair is pushed off with a blunt blade, worked down the length of the hide. It comes away in wet mats rather than single hairs. What is left underneath is no longer skin and not yet a page. Your forearms would ache by the end of one hide. Lime dries the hands out and splits them at the knuckles, and the splits do not close while the work goes on. Then the frame, and this is where parchment is actually made. The frame has a name. It is called a hearse. The wet hide is hung inside it and pulled outward in every direction at once, until it becomes a drumhead. Cords or leather thongs run from the edge of the skin out to pegs set in the frame. Sometimes a cord passes through a hole punched near the edge. More often the maker folds the edge around a small pebble or a knot of the skin itself and ties behind that so the pull cannot tear through. Turn the pegs and the hide comes taut. That tension is the whole secret of the thing. In the living animal, the collagen fibres run in a random 3-dimensional tangle, in every direction at once, more like felt than like cloth. Under tension, as the water leaves, those fibres swing round and lie down flat, parallel to the surface. They dry in that new arrangement, and they keep it. That realignment is what makes parchment parchment. Release the tension too early, and the sheet cockles into ridges you can never press out. While it dries, the maker scrapes it, and the tool is worth knowing by name. It is a lunellum, a knife shaped like a crescent moon. Curved edge, no point at all. The missing point is the design. A lunellum cannot stab. A pointed blade would go straight through a wet stretched hide and end a fortnight of work in 1 second. So the maker draws the curve across the surface instead, lifting thickness away in slivers rather than cutting into it. Long, shallow strokes. That is the whole motion. Then the surface is wetted and left to dry slowly, and scraped again, and wetted again. Each pass takes the sheet thinner and more even. This is not one afternoon of work. From the day the hide went into the lime to the day the sheet came off the frame, the best estimate is 3 weeks or more. Most of that is waiting. You could not hurry it. If you dried it too fast, in sun or near a fire, the collagen turned to glue and the sheet was ruined. What comes off the frame is not a uniform white rectangle. One face is the hair side. It is darker and faintly speckled, because the follicle pattern survives everything the lime did to it. The other face is the flesh side, paler and softer, with a slight nap to it. Put your finger on a real leaf, and you can feel the difference between the two faces in the dark. Two faces, one animal. The animal is still in the page. It never stops being in the page. Look along a leaf at a shallow angle, and you find veins, running like rivers across the surface. You can pick out where the spine ran. And you find holes. Some belong to the maker, where the lunellum bit too deep and the tension pulled the nick open into a lens-shaped gap. Once it opens on the frame, it stays open. There is no repairing it. The sheet was not thrown away for it either. Other holes were there before the animal died. The warble fly lays its eggs on cattle in summer. The larva burrows in and spends months under the hide of a living calf, breathing through a small opening it keeps clear in the skin. It leaves a weak spot behind. On the frame, under tension, that weak spot opens. So a fly that was alive 1200 years ago put a hole in a page you can still go and look at. The scribes wrote around them. The line of text runs up to the edge of the hole, stops, and picks up again on the other side. Sometimes the edge of the hole is bound around with thread to stop it spreading further. Nobody treated it as a flaw worth hiding. You can still see all of this on the real pages under glass in ordinary daylight. The book does not pretend the animals were not animals. Now the arithmetic, because it changes the size of the book in your head. An average calfskin yields roughly 3.5 medium sheets. One animal, 3.5 sheets. The usual estimate for the Book of Kells is the skins of about 185 calves. Treat that as an estimate, because that is exactly what it is. It rests on assumptions about the size of the original sheets and how much was trimmed away at the edges. Still, hold the number for a moment. 185 calves is not a corner of a field. It is a working herd, kept and fed and bred over years, in a climate you would not choose for keeping cattle. Those animals had to be reared before a single line was written. Somebody chose which of them would become a book. We do not know who chose, and we do not know where that herd stood. Set the number against another book from roughly the same era. The Codex Amiatinus is a single-volume Latin Bible made in Northumbria. It runs to 1,040 leaves of vellum, and it weighs about 75 pounds. Lift 75 pounds in your arms and you have lifted the book. It was one of 3 such Bibles made at the same house at the same time. 3 of them. The herd behind a project on that scale is a serious agricultural fact. So here is what follows, and it is not romantic. A monastery that meant to make books had to be a farm first. It needed calves, which meant cows, which meant pasture and byres and fodder cut and stacked for winter. It needed lime, which meant limestone, a kiln and fuel. It needed water in volume, and timber for frames, and people who understood cattle. Books grew out of livestock. First a farm, then a library. That is why the great book-making houses were also great landowners, every one of them. With the sheets finished, the book proper begins. A sheet folded once down the middle makes a bifolium, 2 leaves joined at the fold. Nest 4 or 5 bifolia inside one another, and you have a quire, sometimes called a gathering. That is the unit the scribe worked in, and the unit the binder later sewed through. If you have a paperback within reach, it is built the same way. Bend the block of it, and you can see the gatherings. The nesting was not careless. The sheets were turned so that hair side faced hair side, and flesh faced flesh at every opening. That matters, because the 2 faces take ink differently and hold light differently. Open a book made this way, and the 2 pages in front of you match, in colour and in texture. Open a careless one, and your eye snags on the difference all the way down the spread. It is a decision made for a reader who would not be born for centuries. Then the page had to be given lines to sit on. The scribe pricked small holes down the outer margin with an awl or the point of a knife. Often he drove them through several leaves at once, so the holes agreed from page to page. Then he ruled between the pricks, early on with a hard point, which leaves a furrow on one side and a ridge on the other. Later with lead, which leaves a grey line still visible today. In the Book of Kells, the ruling gives 16 to 18 lines to a page. That is a generous open page, with room for very large letters. Run your thumb across a hard-point ruled leaf, and you can feel the grooves under the ink. The lines came before the words. Measure first. Then write. Every page was measured before it was written, by somebody holding a straight edge in a cold room. One more thing before we go anywhere near ink. All of this took skill, and years to learn it. Judging when a hide had had enough lime. Knowing how far to turn a peg before the edge gives. Reading a skin for its thin places before the blade finds them. Somebody stood in that shed and did every part of it for the Book of Kells. We do not know one single thing about them. No name, no house, not even a certain country. The one who prepared these skins is exactly as anonymous as the one who wrote on them. The day that book was made in was cut into pieces by a bell, not by a clock. There were no clocks. The bell rang, and whatever a monk was doing stopped, and he went to the church. It rang 8 times in every 24 hours, and the pieces it made were not equal. Some were 3 hours long. One of them fell in the middle of the night you are lying in now. The shape of it came from a document written in the first half of the 6th century. The Rule of St. Benedict is a short book of practical instructions for living together. When to rise, what to eat, who sleeps where, how to treat a latecomer. It spread across the West over the following centuries and became the frame most monastic days hung on. Irish practice had older traditions of its own, and we should not pretend the two were identical. But the rhythm you are about to hear is broadly the shape of it. There were 8 gatherings. Vigils came first, in the middle of the night, roughly 2 in the morning. Lauds followed at first light. Then prime, terces, sexton none, spaced through the working day. Vespers came in the evening as the light went. Compline came last, immediately before bed. 8 times, every day, for life. Count those against your own day, which probably has 2 or 3 fixed points in it, and one of them is a train or a school gate. The hours themselves were not your hours. Daylight was divided into 12 parts, whatever the season. In June an hour was long. In December the same hour was short, because there was less daylight to cut up. The units stretched and shrank across the year, and nobody found that strange. Their hours breathed with the season. Time was a thing the sun did, not a thing a machine counted. Your hour is fixed at 60 minutes only because a machine keeps it that way. Sleep came in 2 parts. A monk went to bed after Compline, in the dark, and slept. Then the bell went in the middle of the night, and he got up for vigils. After vigils he went back and slept again until first light. 2 sleeps, with an office of singing between them. Nobody slept the night through. Whatever time it is where you are lying now, that bell would already have gone. Think about what that involved in a stone building in winter. No heating on the way, and no light but what somebody carried. A man got off a straw mattress in the dark, in the clothes he had slept in, and walked a stone passage to a cold church. If you have ever been woken at 2 in the morning and had to stand up and be useful, you know the feeling in the legs. They did it every night, for decades, without expecting it to change. The rule does not leave the rest of the day vague. Chapter 48 sets out manual labour and reading, and it moves the hours with the season. Because the daylight moves. Neither was a small part of the day. Reading was not leisure, and it was not optional. Reading was work. It was assigned, timed and checked, in the same way the field work was. Nobody chose their own book, and nobody chose when to put it down. You choose both. There is one detail in that chapter worth stopping on. At the beginning of Lent, every monk was given one book from the library. One book. He was to read it straight through, in order, over the whole of Lent, and there was a check because somebody went round to see whether the reading had actually happened. Roughly 40 days, one volume, and a person making sure you had finished it. That is the reading speed of a world where books were rare. Not because the monks were slow readers, because there were not many books, and each one was expected to be finished properly rather than sampled. Count what you could reach without standing upright now. A phone in one hand holds more text than that entire library held, a whole season and one book, and someone checking. Meals were not conversation. One brother read aloud from a book while the rest ate, and the room stayed silent. The reader ate afterwards. The book was chosen for him, not by him. The reading ran the length of the meal, and the meal ended when the reading ended. Everything a room full of hungry people normally does with words had to be done some other way. Work out how you would get the salt at a table where nobody speaks. The answer in the Cluniac houses was a full sign language. It was written down. The customary compiled by the monk Bernard of Cluny lists well over 100 signs, described in words on the page, so that a new house could learn them. This was not gesture and guesswork. It was a taught vocabulary, with rules about when you were permitted to use it at all. The range of it tells you what daily life was actually made of. There were signs for every kind of fish. Signs for fruit, for vegetables, for drink. Signs for the vessels of the kitchen and the vessels of the refectory. Signs for garments and for bedclothes. Signs for the different classes of service book, which is a fine distinction to make with your hands. And signs for people, monks and clerks and laymen, and for each officer of the house. So a book was asked for with a sign, not a word. A man wanting a particular volume made a movement, and another man crossed the room and fetched it. In several of the customaries, the general sign for a book is made by moving the hand as if turning a leaf. Whether that same gesture was used in every house, we do not know, because the customaries differ from place to place. You would learn them the way you learn to walk down a familiar stair in the dark. Now the room itself. The best picture we have of where this work happened is a drawing made around the year 820. It is called the Plan of St. Gall. It is laid out on 5 pieces of parchment stitched together into one large sheet, and it maps an entire monastery, building by building, labelled throughout in Latin. It is the nearest thing to a photograph you are going to get. It is an idealised plan rather than a survey of a real place. Nobody has found a monastery built exactly to it, and it is not clear it was ever meant to be built as drawn. Treat it as a picture of what an ideal Carolingian monastery looked like in the minds of the people who made the drawing. It is a drawing of an intention, which is still close enough to stand in the doorway of. On that plan, the scriptorium sits against the north side of the church. Above it is the library, labelled in Latin as the library above, stacked directly over the writing room. Windows are marked, 7 desks are drawn around the walls, and there is a table in the middle of the floor for work in progress. That is the whole room. 7 places, and a table, and fewer seats than most rooms you have sat in. Stand in that doorway a moment. A room small enough to cross in a few strides, 7 desks against the walls under the windows, and the weight of the library directly overhead. The work happened where the light fell. Glass existed then, but it was rare and costly, and we do not know what these particular openings had in them. When the weather closed in, the shutters were the only answer, and the shutters took the light away with them. Here is the thing about that room that people find hardest to believe. There was no fire in it, no hearth, no brazier, nothing with a flame in it at all. The risk was too great, to the parchment, to the ink, and to a building packed with dry timber and books. So the writing room sat at the temperature of the outside air, minus the wind. In winter, that is a room you can see your breath in all day. Warmth lived in a different room entirely. The same plan shows a calefactory, the warming room, on the east side of the cloister. It was heated by a furnace that pushed hot air under the floor and let it up again through vents. The heat came up gentle and even across the whole floor. That was the one reliably heated room in the place. Not the church, not the dormitory, not the scriptorium. Monks came in from the cold in shifts, warmed through, and went back out to it. Nowhere else was a temperature you would call comfortable. So the scribes went and warmed their hands, then came back and worked until their hands stopped answering, then went and warmed them again. Think about your own fingers now. Wherever they are resting, cold fingers do not hold a fine line. They overshoot, they shake at the end of a stroke, they lose the last part of a curve. The work in front of them needed control measured in fractions of a millimetre. Winter did two other things to the work. The usable light was short. At those latitudes, midwinter gives perhaps 6 or 7 hours of working light, and less than that under heavy cloud, which is an estimate rather than a measurement. Ink also thickens as it cools, so it leaves the pen thick and uneven. A page made in February was fighting the room. A page made in June had long light and a warmer bench. Somewhere in that book there are pages made in each, and you cannot tell which is which by looking at them now. Whoever made the Book of Kells lived inside a day shaped like this. Woken in the dark, fed in silence, told when to read and when to stop. Hands cold for half the year, every hour of it accounted for by somebody else's rule. And we still cannot put one name to any of them. No colophon, no signature, no line at the end saying who held the pen. Which brings you to the desk. Not the room now, the desk. A sloped board, a leaf of vellum pricked and ruled and waiting on it, and beside that the things a scribe actually held. A knife in the left hand, held there all day long. A horn of ink set into a hole cut in the board. And a feather, cut to a shape that took years to learn to cut. We know a fair amount about those tools, because they survive in pictures and in fragments and in the marks they left. What we know much less about is what the work did to the body holding them. Hours bent over a board, in the cold, with one more letter to finish before the light goes. A few scribes left small complaints in the margins about exactly that. Those are almost the only voices we get, and not one of them belongs to Kells. So put your hand on the desk. The slope in front of you is wood, worn pale where forearms have rested. What you are holding is a feather, not a metaphor for a pen, an actual flight feather, pulled from the wing of a goose and cut down into a working tool. It is lighter than you expect, and it weighs almost nothing at all. The whole apparatus of medieval learning ran on this: a bird's feather, a horn of black liquid, and a knife. Not every feather will do, and the scribe wants one of the outer flight feathers, the strong ones at the leading edge. Goose was standard across Europe. Swan was used for large display work where the letters needed a broader stroke. Crow gave the finest line, for small script and marginal notes. And there is a detail here that tells you the tool was made for a body. Feathers from a bird's left wing curve outward, away from the face of a right-handed scribe. So a right-handed monk reached for left wing feathers. The curve went out past his knuckles instead of sweeping back toward his eye. Left-handed scribes wanted the right wing. The feather then has to be prepared before it is any use. The barbs are stripped off the lower shaft, because they only get in the way. The shaft is hardened, usually with heat and sand, so that the tip will not splay under pressure. Then the cutting. The end is sliced away at an angle to make a nib. A slit is cut up the middle of that nib, from the tip back toward the shaft. That slit is the whole invention. It lets the hollow shaft carry ink down and release it at a controlled rate. Without the slit, you have a stick that blots. With it, you have an instrument that can hold a line the width of a hair. Here is the part people never picture. A quill goes blunt fast, and the tip wears down and spreads within a page or two of steady work. So the scribe recuts it, again and again, many times in a single day. Your work is interrupted constantly. You write, you feel the line thicken, you stop, you trim, you test the stroke on a scrap, you go back in. Then the line thickens again. That rhythm is the actual texture of the working day, which is why the knife matters as much as the pen. The penknife is the scribe's second tool, and it is never out of reach. It cuts the nib, and it holds the page flat against the slope, because parchment does not lie down obediently. It curls with the weather. In most medieval pictures of a scribe, you will see both hands occupied. The right hand has the quill. The left hand has the knife pressed to the skin. And the knife does a third job. It erases. On parchment, you cannot rub a mistake out, and you cannot paint over it. You shave it away. The blade lifts a thin layer off the surface of the skin and takes the wrong letter with it. Do that carefully, and the page carries on. Do it too hard, and you go through. There is no third option. This is why old pages sometimes carry a patch that is thinner than the rest, faintly translucent when held up to a window. Think about what that does to your attention. Every stroke you make is close to permanent. You are not drafting. There is no undoing here, only surgery. Your shoulders would know it by the second hour. The head tips forward, the right forearm floats above the slope, the left hand holds pressure on the skin. Nothing in the posture lets you settle back into the furniture. You are held in one position for as long as the light lasts. Now the ink. Almost every black letter in medieval Europe was written in iron gall ink, and it is worth knowing what that is, because it is not what most people assume. It is not soot in water, and it is not a paint. It is the product of a chemical reaction made from 4 ingredients in roughly equal measure. Oak galls, iron sulfate, gum arabic. Water, that is the entire recipe, and the strangest of the 4 is the first. An oak gall is a growth, not a fruit. A gall wasp lays an egg in the tissue of an oak, and the tree responds by building a hard round case around the larva. It is a defence that becomes a nursery. Those cases are rich in tannic acid. Collectors gathered them off the branches by the sackful. If you had walked an oak wood in Ireland or in England in the 9th century, you would have been walking through an ink supply. The galls are crushed, then steeped in water or simmered, until the liquid goes the colour of strong dark tea. That liquid is strained off, and then the iron sulfate goes in, which is the moment worth standing in. It was called copras, or green vitriol, and it looks like pale green crystal. As it meets the tannins, the whole liquid darkens. Almost at once, a brownish tea turns near black in front of you. The gum arabic comes last and does 3 jobs. It thickens the liquid so that it does not run off the nib in a flood. It helps the ink flow evenly as you write. And it binds the black to the surface of the skin. Some houses used wine or vinegar in place of water. Recipes varied from monastery to monastery, and there was no single standard. You would smell it before you saw it, faintly metallic and sour. Now the important part, and it is the reason we can read any of this, iron gall ink is faintly acidic, and it does not sit on the surface of parchment the way paint does. It bites into it. The ink and the skin become one material. That is why you can scrape at an old page and still find a ghost of the letter underneath. It is why 1200 years have not taken the writing off the calf, and it is also why some manuscripts are destroying themselves. Where a mix ran too heavy on iron, the acid never stopped working. Over centuries it has slowly eaten down through the page. On the worst examples, the letters have fallen out as holes. What remains is a text you read as absence, the shape of a word punched clean through. The chemistry that preserved the book is the chemistry attacking it. Conservators live with that contradiction every working day. The scribe's kit was small. A penknife. Several quills, cut and waiting, because you did not want to be shaping a new one halfway through a line. An ink horn, which is exactly what it sounds like, a cow horn holding ink. The desks were built with holes to take them. Some were strapped to the arm of the chair or hung at the side. And there was one more requirement, which is not a tool at all. Your hands had to be intact. A monk with a fresh cut on a finger could not work that day. Blood on a page ruins weeks of labour. The same is true of a running nose in a cold room, or a hand shaking with cold. Your body is part of the equipment. There is a whole class of scribal complaint about exactly this, and it survives because scribes wrote it in the margins where nobody official was looking. Before any of that touched skin, though, there was wax. Nobody learned to write on parchment, which was far too valuable for practice. Beginners and drafters worked on wax tablets, wooden leaves with a shallow recess filled with beeswax, marked with a pointed stylus and smoothed flat again with the blunt end. Endlessly reusable, utterly ordinary, which is exactly why almost none of them survive, and why one Irish find matters more than it should. In 1914 a set was pulled out of a bog near Ballyhutherland in County Antrim. The Springmount bog tablets are 6 small wooden leaves bound into a booklet, with psalms written into the wax surface. They are usually dated to the late 7th or early 8th century. Peat kept what a dry church would have lost. They are the earliest surviving example of Irish writing in the Latin alphabet, and they are not a treasure, they are somebody's working copy. Hold those two things side by side. Wax for the working out, and skin for the fair copy. You would have spent years on wax before anybody let you near good parchment, which brings us to the body, and to what scribes actually said about the work. They said it was hard. A well-known scribal maxim, found in manuscripts from the 8th century through to the 12th, runs roughly like this. 3 fingers hold the pen, but the whole body labours, and the man who cannot write imagines that it is no work at all. That line survived 400 years because copyists kept recognising themselves in it. Others were more specific about the damage. Scribes recorded that the craft bends the back, dims the sight, and twists the stomach and the sides. One wrote that he had frozen as he worked, and had finished by candlelight what the daylight would not let him finish. Another asked the reader to turn the pages carefully, and to think of the man whose fingers had ached over them. These are complaints, set down by people at the end of a long day. So sit in that for a moment. 3 hours in, your right shoulder is a knot. Your neck has been at the same angle since the office ended. Your eyes are the real problem, because the lettering is small and the window is the only lamp you trust. There is no fire in this room. Your fingers stiffen, and a stiff hand makes a wavering line, and a wavering line on parchment cannot be taken back. How fast could anyone go? We do not know with any precision, and the estimates vary enormously. A complete Bible copied by one man is often put somewhere between about 15 months and several years of working time. But that figure misleads a little, because it describes something that rarely happened. Most houses never attempted a whole Bible. The ordinary work was single Gospels, Psalters and service books, made to be used and used hard. And a finished book was worth defending, which is where one of the odder medieval habits comes in. Scribes and libraries wrote curses into their books, not warnings. Curses, a 13th century English example, names the abbey that owns the volume and calls down anathema on anyone who steals it, sells it, or cuts pages out of it. The threats run to damnation, to disease, to a thief's name being struck out of the book of the living. That tells you the value better than any price could. You do not curse a cheap thing. A single book represented a herd of calves, a year of somebody's eyesight, and pigments that had come a long way. It was often the most expensive object in the building after the altar plate. A curse is what a community writes when it has no lock strong enough and no law that reaches far enough. Which makes the Book of Kells stranger the longer you look. It carries no curse, and it carries no signature. Nobody asks the reader to pray for the man who wrote it, and that was the ordinary courtesy of the trade. There is no note at the end saying who finished it, where, or under which abbot. Scribes signed lesser books constantly. They complained, they dated, they asked for a drink. The greatest of them says nothing. And whatever that silence hides, it does not hide expense. You can see the money on every page. It is in the colour. Between 2004 and 2006, the Book of Kells was put under a laser. Not damaged, not sampled, not scraped. The technique is micro-Raman spectroscopy, and it works by shining a narrow beam onto a spot the width of a few hairs. Most of the light comes back unchanged. A tiny fraction comes back shifted, and the pattern of that shift is a molecular fingerprint. Every pigment has one of its own. 681 sites were measured across the 4 volumes using 2 laser wavelengths. Nothing was removed from the book, no flake was lifted, and no corner was cut. That matters, because for most of the 20th century the only sure way to identify a pigment was to take a piece of it away. Nobody was cutting this book. So for the first time somebody could ask the page directly what it was made of. The page answered, and one answer overturned 100 years of belief. Here is the belief. It was repeated in books, in lectures and on museum labels, that the blue in the Book of Kells was ultramarine. Ultramarine is ground lapis lazuli. In the early medieval period, lapis came from essentially one region on Earth, the mines of what is now northeastern Afghanistan. If that blue were lapis, then a monastery on the Atlantic edge of Europe was buying stone that had crossed a continent to reach it. That was a magnificent argument, and people leaned on it hard. It made the book a proof of reach. It said these islands were not the far edge of anything, that goods and money moved from Central Asia to a scriptorium in the north. You will still find it printed, and it is a good story. The laser found no lapis lazuli in the Book of Kells at all. The blue is indigo, consistent with indigo taken from woad, a plant grown across northern Europe for exactly this purpose. Woad is a crop. It carries yellow flowers, and it will grow in a cold, wet climate without complaint. The leaves are cut, crushed and fermented, and the blue is drawn out of them. It is not exotic. It is agriculture. Somebody local grew the colour that people spent a century calling a treasure from Afghanistan. The other famous import was absent as well. Purple from the murex sea snail, the dye of emperors, does not appear anywhere. The purples in the book come from lichen instead. Orcine, taken from lichens scraped off rock, which northern coasts have in quantity. 2 of the colours that supposedly proved long-distance trade turn out to have grown within a few days of where you are sitting. So what is actually in it? Red lead, an orange red also called minium. Orpiment, a bright yellow arsenic sulfide with a metallic glint. Verdigris, a green made from copper. Carbon black and iron gall ink for the letters. Ochres, which are coloured earths. Gypsum for white. And lichen purple. And one more that was made rather than gathered, a green often called vergort, which is not a pigment at all, but a method. You lay indigo down first, and then you brush orpiment over the top of it. Blue under yellow. The eye reads green. It is a workshop trick, and it tells you the person mixing these colours understood layering as well as painters working centuries later with far better supplies. The Kells makers also mixed indigo with white, to lift it and give it depth, and to make it read like the expensive thing. Now the point most people get wrong. There is no gold leaf in the Book of Kells. There is no silver leaf either, not on one page, and not anywhere in the 4 volumes. If you have stood in front of that case and thought you were looking at gold, you were looking at orpiment. It is a yellow mineral with a hard shine, and it behaves like metal in candlelight. But there is no metal. It is worth saying plainly, because the assumption runs very deep. And it is easy to hear all of this as poverty, a monastery faking grandeur it could not afford, reaching for imitations because the real materials were out of range. That is not what the evidence shows. These are craft decisions, made by people who knew precisely what effect they wanted on the page and worked out how to get it from what grew nearby. Imitation and skill are not opposites here, they sit in the same hand. There is also a geography folded into these materials, and it is one of the few hard threads we have. Woad and lichen and copper all point north. They are things you can grow, gather or trade for in Ireland and in Scotland. Some scholars have used the pigment evidence in the long argument about where this book was actually made. It narrows the field, but it does not close the question, and it was never going to. Because a pigment tells you what was available, not where a hand was sitting. Materials travel, and so do the people who grind them. A monk trained in one house carries his recipes to the next. What the analysis rules out is the version where this book proves a supply line running from Central Asia. What it leaves standing is a book made largely from the ground it sat on. Which ground we still do not know. Then there is the part that is difficult to sit with. Orpiment is an arsenic sulfide. It is arsenic. The yellow standing in for gold across these pages is a poison. It was ground by hand on a stone slab, dry, in a room with the shutters closed against the wind. Fine yellow dust would rise as you worked it. You would breathe it. You would carry it on your fingers to your bread. Verdigris is its own problem. It is a copper compound made by exposing copper to vinegar fumes until a green crust forms, and it is corrosive. On a great many medieval manuscripts, the green has eaten straight through the parchment. Where a green letter used to be there is now a hole in the shape of that letter. The colour ate the word. You can read a lost word by its damage, which is a strange kind of survival. The people doing this did not understand it in those terms. There was no name for arsenic poisoning, and no reason to connect a tremor or a stomach complaint to the yellow jar on the shelf. They knew some materials were unpleasant to handle. They did not know they were spending their working lives inside them. A man might grind pigment for 40 years and never suspect the yellow of anything except expense. The labour was constant because colour was made in the house. Minerals were ground on a stone slab with a handheld muller, sometimes for hours. Because the finer the grain, the better the colour lies down. It is dull, heavy work. The powder is sieved, and some pigments are washed repeatedly to take the impurities out. Then a binder goes in, either a gum solution or egg white beaten to a froth, and left to settle, which is called glaire. Then it is tested on a scrap, looked at, adjusted. No 2 batches came out the same. The galls differ by tree and by season. A woad vat depends on temperature and on how the fermentation went. A red mixed in March and a red mixed in September were not identical reds, and a painter working across months had to manage that difference. It is one reason a page can shift in tone from one side to the other. So put yourself at that slab. The room smells of vinegar, sharp at the back of your throat, because the copper green is working somewhere nearby. There is a metallic edge coming off the ink. Under both of them is the animal smell of the parchment itself, which never entirely leaves the skin. Your right arm is making a small circular motion, and has been for an hour. Your wrist aches in a different place than it does from writing, and there is a problem here with no solution. Colour changes with the light, so a blue mixed at a window on a grey northern afternoon is a different blue by candle flame. Orpiment in particular comes alive by fire and sits flat by day. By candle flame, the yellow goes soft and deep. So the makers were building an object that would mostly be seen in church light, while judging it in daylight. You would have to hold both versions in your head at once. The room has no fire in it. A decorated page was not the work of an afternoon. It was days, and in some cases weeks, of sitting at a slope in the cold, laying colour into shapes that had been ruled out beforehand. Your hand has to stay steady through all of it. The design leaves you no room to wander, because the outline is already set, and every field of colour has a border it cannot cross. And now the thing that has never stopped bothering anyone who looks at this book. On some pages of the Book of Kells, the colour was never put on. The outline is there, and the drawing is finished, ruled and set and waiting. The paint is simply absent. Not faded, not lifted, not lost to damp. It was never applied at all. Whoever was going to fill those shapes stopped, and did not come back to them. There are guesses. Illness, death, a pigment that ran out and never arrived. A community that had to leave in a hurry. A patron who stopped paying, or an abbot who changed his mind about the whole project. We do not know, and there is nothing inside the book to tell us, because it names nobody and dates nothing. Those unfinished pages are the clearest evidence we have of the working process, and they explain nothing, which raises the question sitting underneath all of it. Somebody stopped. Somebody, not everybody. That word carries more than it looks, because it assumes a person. We have been talking as though there was one maker at this desk, with one knife and one jar of yellow. The book itself says otherwise. The letters change, not in a single place, but across long stretches, and the changes are consistent enough to be counted. Some pages are written by a hand that runs even and disciplined, holding its line for folio after folio. Others open up, larger and looser, willing to let a letter sprawl out into the margin. The colour habits shift along with the script. Scholars have spent a century trying to work out how many people are in there, and the count has never settled. So the question is not only who made this book, it is how many pairs of hands you are looking at. So, how many people held these pens? It is a plain question, and it has no clean answer. Nobody signed the Book of Kells. There is no closing line where a scribe gives his name, no request for a prayer, no date, no place. The book names nobody at all. What you have instead is the handwriting itself, and the arguments people have built on top of it. That is the whole evidence base. Everything from here rests on very close looking. Paleography is the study of old handwriting, and it is harder work than it sounds. A specialist looking for separate scribes starts with letter shapes. The bowl of the letterer may close tightly, or stay open at the top. The descender of a G may curl left or hook right. These are habits rather than decisions. A person writing for hours does not think about them. That is exactly why they are useful to you. Then there is the angle of the pen. Hold a cut quill at a steady tilt and the thick strokes all fall one way. Change the tilt and the texture of the whole page changes with it. You can see this without training if you set two pages side by side. One will feel more upright, another will lean. Specialists measure it properly. They use instruments and grids. But your eye catches it first, before you can say why. Abbreviations matter more than you would expect. Latin scribes shortened common words constantly to save parchment and time. The word for and, the word for is the endings of nouns. Each shortening has a mark, and each scribe forms that mark his own way. A bar over a letter may be straight in one hand and hooked in another. It may sit high or low. Those marks are among the most reliable separators a paleographer has. After that comes spacing. Some scribes crowd their words, some let them breathe, some rule their lines and then ignore the ruling. The end of the line is the real test, because Latin does not fit the width of a page politely. A scribe running out of room has choices. He can compress the last word, split it, carry it up, or tuck it in below. Each man tends to solve it the same way every time. Ink colour is another signal. Iron gall ink does not stay one shade. It varies with the batch, with the water, and with the age of the mixture. A stretch of pages in one tone, then a shift, can mark a change of hand. Decoration gets checked the same way. The little initials that open each verse are made by the 100, and consistency across them can be counted, if you have the patience for it. You could do a version of this yourself, with good photographs and no Latin at all. Look at one page, then at a page 40 leaves further on, then come back. Cover the words with your hand and watch only the shapes. If the letters begin to sit rounder, if the lines close up, if the whole texture tightens, then you have found the kind of change that starts an argument. Put all of that together and you get an argument, not a proof. That distinction matters here more than anywhere else. Two experts can look at the same folio and disagree about whether the hand has changed. One sees a new scribe, the other sees the same man on a different day, with a fresh quill after a bad night. Both readings are defensible. Neither can be settled, because there is no signature to check against. The most influential attempt was made by Françoise Henry, an Irish art historian who spent decades on this book. She worked through the manuscript page by page and concluded that at least 3 scribes had written it. She did not know their names, so she gave them letters. Hand A, Hand B, Hand C. That is the whole naming ceremony you get. 3 men reduced to 3 letters of the alphabet. A 4th has been proposed since. Hand D, argued from folio 104 recto. Not everyone accepts it. The case rests on a stretch of writing that behaves differently from the pages around it. It also rests on how much variation you are willing to allow inside one person's work. If you are generous, it is hand B on an odd day. If you are strict, it is a 4th man. The argument has not closed. The artists were separated the same way and given nicknames instead of names. The goldsmith, who worked the metallic effects and the tight interlace. The illustrator, who handled the narrative scenes. The portrait painter, who did the figures. Those labels are modern inventions made for convenience. Nobody in the 9th century called anybody the goldsmith. The names describe what you can see on the page, which is all anyone has to go on. Some scholars have gone further. They have suggested that as many as 12 people worked on the book, counting scribes, artists, and the ones who prepared the pages. 12 sits at the high end. It is contested, but even at 3 the point holds, and it is worth saying plainly. None of them can be named. Not one. You will not find a name inside the book, and no document outside it supplies one. Now hold that against another book, made in the same world in the same centuries. The Lindisfarne Gospels. Almost everything you know about who made that book comes from a few lines added long after it was finished. In the second half of the 10th century, around the year 970, a monk called Aldred wrote a colophon into it. He also wrote an Old English gloss between the lines of the Latin. Aldred's note gives 4 men and states what each of them did. Eadfrith, Bishop of Lindisfarne, wrote it. Ethelwald bound it. Bilfrith, an anchorite, ornamented it with metal. Aldred glossed it, and named himself doing so. That is a complete production line, recorded. You can point at a page and say who wrote it, who bound it, and who covered it in metal. You can even name the man who came back long afterwards to explain the Latin in English, and the Lindisfarne Gospels look like one man's book. The style holds steady from the first page to the last, and that consistency supports Aldred's claim that Eadfrith wrote all of it himself. Estimates of how long that took commonly land around 2 years of full-time work. 2 years of one man's life spent on a single book. It is a plausible figure, and it is anchored to a name you can say out loud. So consider where that leaves you. Two great gospel books, from the same island world, within perhaps 100 years of each other. For one, 4 names, 4 jobs, and a rough length of time. For the other, nothing. No name, no place, no year, no patron. Only letters of the alphabet handed out by a 20th century scholar. That gap is not a small detail. It is the shape of this entire episode. The mistakes in the Book of Kells are evidence too, and there are more of them than you might expect. At Matthew chapter 10 verse 34, the Latin word for joy appears where the word for sword belongs, so the sentence says something quite different from what was meant. It is a short step away from correct. Nobody caught it. Or somebody caught it and chose to leave it. We do not know which. In Luke chapter 3 there is a genealogy, a long chain of fathers and sons running backwards. The Book of Kells has an extra ancestor in that chain. Somebody added a generation that should not be there. That is the kind of error that happens when a scribe copies from an exemplar and loses his place. It tells you something real. The men making this book were working from other books, and they were tired. Then there are the canon tables. These sit at the front of a gospel book and work as a concordance, letting a reader find the same episode across the 4 gospels by number. In the Book of Kells they were pressed into a decorative framework so tightly that they stopped functioning. The design won. The tool lost. Worse, the chapter numbers that would make them usable for you were never written into the margins at all. Françoise Henry described the handling of those numbers as irresponsible. That is her word, and it is a hard one from a scholar who loved this manuscript. It points at something odd. Somebody planned the tables and drew the frames, and then the practical part was abandoned. You are looking at a book that is astonishing to see and awkward to use. Those 2 facts sit together on the same pages, and they do not cancel each other out. Turn to folio 34 recto, and you reach the page most people know. This is the Chi Rho page, opening the account of Christ's birth in Matthew. The Greek letters Chi Rho and iota swell until they fill almost the whole sheet. Your eye goes to the great curve of the Chi first, because it is built to take it. Then it slides down into the interlace, where the line drifts and doubles back. Then it stops finding an edge to hold on to. And at the foot of that same page there are cats. 2 of them sit with mice on their backs. 2 more mice nibble at a round white disc marked with a cross, usually read as a communion wafer. Nearby an otter holds a fish. There are moths in there as well. Whoever painted the most famous page in the book put a small animal joke along the bottom of it and left you no explanation of what it means. There are other pages worth knowing by number, so you can find them yourself later. The Virgin and Child is folio 7 verso. Christ enthroned is folio 32 verso. The Temptation is folio 202 verso, and the Arrest is folio 114 recto. The Opening of John is folio 292 recto. The Opening of Matthew is folio 29 recto. 6 pages and no maker attached to any of them. And then there is the thing that keeps this book unsettled. Some of the decoration was drawn out in ink and never coloured. The line work is there, finished and confident, waiting for pigment that never arrived. If you turn to those folios you can see the plan and the absence in one glance. No agreed explanation exists for it. The possibilities are all reasonable, and not one of them can be demonstrated from any surviving source. The work may have been interrupted. The person who did that job may have died or left. The book may have been moved before it was done. Or the community may simply have stopped. Each of those has been argued in print by people who know the manuscript far better than most of us ever will. Not one can be proved. You should not expect one of them to win. We do not know why the Book of Kells is unfinished. Which brings us to the years themselves. Something was happening outside the scriptorium in this period, out past the wall and the shoreline. It is written down briefly in annals kept by men who had reason to be exact about it. The entries are short. They give you a year, a place, and sometimes a number of dead. That is the world these pages were made in, and it is where we go now. The first entry that matters here is from the year 793. In that year, the monastery on Lindisfarne was attacked from the sea. Raiders came ashore, killed some of the community, took what could be carried, and left. The annals record it in a line or two. It is often treated as the beginning of something, mainly because literate men wrote about it at the time and were shocked. That tells you about the sources, not about the raids. 2 years later, in 795, raiders reached Iona. The island sits off the west coast of Scotland, and it can be reached by sea in a day from several directions. You can see why a community would want that, and it had always been the strength of the place. A monastery on a small island was connected to everywhere along that coast. The same water that carried its books and its people could carry other boats just as easily. Nothing about the island had changed. What had changed was who else was on the water. In 802, the monastery on Iona was burned. In 806, 68 members of the community were killed in a single attack. The place on the island where this happened is now called Martyrs Bay. 68 is a specific number, and it is worth holding for a moment. That is not damage to a building, that is most of the working population of a small house, gone in one day. You have spent 6 chapters inside a house that size. There was a further attack in 825. The annals say the raiders were searching for the shrine that held Columba's relics. A shrine of that kind would have been metalwork. Metal was portable and worth money. That is the plainest reading of it. The bones inside mattered enormously to the community, and not at all to the men who came for the box. Those two valuations of one object are most of the story of this period. Notice how thin the record is, 4 or 5 lines in a set of annals, spread across 32 years. You are holding almost nothing. Nobody wrote a description of what the scriptorium looked like afterwards. Nobody recorded whether the pigments survived, or where the unfinished gatherings were kept, or who carried them. What you have is a year, a place, and sometimes a count. Everything else is inference laid over the gaps. It is worth knowing what an annal actually is. A community kept a running list, year by year, with a line or two set against each. Deaths of abbots, weather, famine, battles, fires. The copies that survive are later than the events they record, sometimes by a long way, so you are reading a copy of a copy. That does not make them false. It does mean the wording you have was set down by someone who was not standing there. The community's response was practical, and it is documented. A new monastery was built inland, in Ireland at Kells in County Meath. The founding is placed in the years around 804 to 807, depending on which annal you follow. The site was chosen for a reason you can work out for yourself. It was away from a coast that could be reached from the sea. Part of the Iona community moved there and settled. Think for a moment about what moving a scriptorium would involve. Finished gatherings, unbound and stacked flat. Exemplars to copy from, knives, awls, rulers, and the pots of made colour that took months to source. All of it carried by hand, by sea and then overland, by people with reason to hurry. Nothing in the annals describes that journey. It is one of the places in this story where you can see the shape of an event and none of its detail. That move is why the book is called the Book of Kells. The name is a place name and a modern convenience, and it records where the manuscript was, not where it was made. That distinction is easy to lose, and it has misled people for a long time. A book can be named after a town it only arrived in, Almost every argument you are about to hear runs into that problem before it starts. So, the arguments. There are 5 main positions, and all of them have been held by serious people. The first says the book was begun on Iona before the raids and carried unfinished to Kells, where it was never completed. That reading explains the unfinished pages neatly, which is both its strength and its weakness. Explanations that fit too comfortably deserve a second look. It remains the most widely repeated version of events. The second says it was begun on Iona and finished at Kells. The third says it was made at Kells entirely, from the first ruled line to the last. Both are possible. The Kells scriptorium existed, and it worked. The difficulty is that we have no 9th century document placing the manuscript in either building. We also have no material test that can separate one Irish workshop from another with real confidence. The fourth position places the book in Northumbria, possibly at Lindisfarne itself. The art of that region and the art of Iona overlap heavily. You would struggle to sort them by eye. That is part of why the idea will not go away. The fifth places it in Pictland, in eastern Scotland. That argument has been revived in recent years, on the strength of Pictish sculpture and metalwork that shares motifs with the manuscript. It is a minority position, and it has not been dismissed. Majority academic opinion has tended toward Iona. That is worth stating accurately. A majority is not a consensus, and a consensus is not a document. There is no colophon, no charter, no letter, no inventory. Nothing survives that says where the book was made. If you ever meet a confident single sentence answering that question, it is compressing an argument that is still running. The honest position is that we do not know. One argument for an early start is worth giving properly, because it is concrete. It is hard to believe an abbot would commission a book of this complexity in years of repeated attack. Parchment on that scale takes a herd of calves. Pigments take trade routes. The work takes years of skilled labour that has to be fed, housed and left undisturbed. For that reason, the beginning of the work is often placed before the year 800. Françoise Henry went further and offered a specific occasion. She suggested the book may have been made to mark the 200th anniversary of Columba's death, which fell in 797. A round anniversary is exactly the kind of thing a monastery marks with an object. She presented it as a suggestion, and you should carry it as one. No source connects the book to that year. It is attractive and unproven, which is a common combination here. It helps to be honest about what kind of thinking this is. Nobody is weighing documents against each other, because there are no documents to weigh. People are weighing plausibility, and plausibility bends toward whatever you already find likely. A scholar who has spent 30 years on Iona will tend to read the evidence toward Iona. That is not dishonesty. It is what happens when a record is this thin, and it is a good reason to hold every one of these positions loosely. Then there is the other reading of the unfinished pages, and it deserves room. A community that lost 68 people in one day was not the same community afterwards, and skills leave with the people who hold them. If the man who mixed and laid the colour was among the dead, the pages he had drawn would stay as line work. Nobody else could safely finish them to that standard. That is one way to read the blank interlace you can still see today. There is a further version of that idea. A community may have lost the will to carry on with the work at all, and in time it may have come to treat the incomplete book as a relic in itself, something touched by the people who were killed and therefore wrong to alter. Books were treated as relics in this world. Nobody can show you this is what happened. It is a possibility, and it should be labelled as one. Now a correction to the old story, and it needs making carefully, because you will meet the old version often. The picture of Iona as abandoned and dead after the raids has been pushed back on by recent archaeological work. The community continued. There is evidence of activity through the 9th century and after, and the site was not emptied. the relationship between Iona and Kells begins to look less like a flight and more like two houses of one federation, working together. That does not overturn the annals. 68 people were still killed in 806, and the monastery was still burned in 802. Both things are true at once. A place can be attacked repeatedly and still keep working. What the archaeology removes is the tidy narrative in which everything simply ends. It does not tell you where the book was made. It does not explain the unfinished pages either. So take stock of what you are actually holding. A handful of annal entries, each a line long, a book with no name inside it and holes in its decoration. A move inland whose date is given as a range of 3 years. 2 centuries of a community's life, compressed into about 6 facts. You could write the whole documentary record of this on one side of a single sheet, and there would be room left over. That thinness is why the arguments do not resolve. There is not enough evidence to force anybody to change position. Iona, Kells, Northumbria, Pictland, each has a case, and each case is built mostly on style, which is the least decisive kind of evidence there is. New scientific work on the pigments and the parchment may narrow it for you one day. So far it has not. And there is one more thing to hold as this chapter closes. The Book of Kells survives. That is a strange fact when you set it against the record you have just heard. Fire, raids, a move inland, and centuries of damp and mice and neglect afterwards. For every book that came through this period, an unknown number did not. We have no list of what was lost, because the lists burned as well. Nothing about that survival was inevitable. The book was not protected by its beauty, and it was not protected by anyone's steady intention across 1,000 years. Manuscripts came through the following centuries by accident about as often as by care. How any of them managed it, what it cost, and who kept copying while all this was going on, is where we go next. For every book that survived, an unknown number did not. Nothing about the survival of any of them was inevitable. Tonight we follow the ones that came through, not the objects this time, but the hands. A book lasts only as long as somebody copies it again. That is the whole mechanism, and it is fragile. Every ancient text you have ever read reached you along a relay like that. A few of the runners left their names, most did not. Stay with me and we will walk some of the links. Begin in southern Italy, in the middle of the 6th century. A Roman official named Cassiodorus had spent his working life in government. He served the Ostrogothic court, held high office, and then withdrew from public affairs altogether. And on his family estate near the coast, he founded a monastery called Vivarium. He wrote a book of instruction for the monks there, the institutions. It set out what they should read and how they should study it. You would not expect a retired official to matter much here. Buried inside that program was one idea that outlived everything else he did. The idea was that copying books was labour proper to a monk, not a chore between prayers. Work, in the way that digging a field is work. He praised the scribe who preached with his hands and never opened his mouth. A man at a desk, he argued, could carry doctrine to people he would never meet, and you can see why that took hold. It gave a repetitive, aching task a purpose large enough to hold a whole life. Many of the men in the earlier chapters were living inside that idea. Vivarium itself did not last long. We do not know exactly how or when it broke up. Its books were scattered, and we cannot follow most of them with any confidence. The house that made the argument disappeared. The argument did not. Copying as a vocation spread to monasteries Cassiodorus never heard of, in countries he never saw. You can hold both of those facts at once for a moment. The founder failed, and the program succeeded. History does that more often than the tidy versions of it admit. Now go north, and forward roughly 150 years. In the northeast of England stood a twin monastery, Monk Wearmouth and Jarrow, run as one house on 2 sites. Bede worked there and wrote there. Its abbot was a man named Ceolfrith. Hold on to that name, because you will need it shortly. Under him the scriptorium took on a scale close to industrial, and he commissioned 3 complete Bibles, each bound as a single volume. A 1-volume Bible is called a pandect. In an age of separate gospel books, that was an unusual and enormous thing to attempt. Think about what 3 of those required: skins by the herd, prepared and cut and ruled, ink by the jar, years of writing by several scribes at once in a house on the northern edge of Europe. 2 of the 3 are gone. 1 survives, and it is called the Codex Amiatinus. It is the oldest complete Latin Bible anywhere in the world, and also a very large object, so moving it is not a one-handed job. It was made by people working in a cold place with limited daylight. In 716, Ceolfrith decided to take 1 of the 3 to Rome. It was to be a gift for the Pope. He was 74 years old. He left Jarrow, crossed the sea, and travelled south through Gaul with a company of monks. Consider your own longest journey, and then take away the roads. He did not arrive. He died on the 29th of September that year at Langres, in Burgundy, and was buried there, a long way from the room where the book was written. The book went on without him, carried by the men who had set out at his side. Sit with that for a moment. An old man dies in a French town, halfway to a city he wanted to see, and the object he was carrying continues down the road without him. That is the shape of this whole story in a single image. The maker stops and the made thing keeps going. It is not tragic, exactly. It is what the arithmetic gives you when a life is shorter than the thing it produced. You will meet that pattern again before the night is finished. Here is the part I want you to keep. The Codex Amiatinus reached Italy and stayed in Italy. It sat there for something like 1,000 years, and for most of that time it was credited to the wrong people. Scholars took it for Italian work of the 6th century, associated with an abbot named Servandus. The dedication page had been altered at some point, and the alteration pointed readers away from its real origin, so the book was read, valued and catalogued under a false account of itself. That held until the late 19th century. In 1888, the antiquarian Giovanni Battista de Rossi worked the problem out. He established that the Amiatinus had been made at Wearmouth or Jarrow in the north of England between about 690 and 716. It was one of Ceolfrith's 3 Bibles, the one that left with an old man who died at Langres. The oldest complete Latin Bible in the world had spent centuries wearing somebody else's name. Nothing about the object had changed, only what you could say about it. Let that land against the book we started with. Attribution is fragile. A manuscript does not know who made it, and it cannot tell you. It will carry a name only if somebody wrote the name down, and nobody erased it afterwards. The Amiatinus had its record altered and lost its makers for 1,000 years. The Book of Kells never had that record in the first place. There is no colophon in it. Nobody signed it. That silence is not damage. It is the original condition of the object. The relay kept running. In 781, a scholar from York named Alcuin was invited to the court of Charlemagne, and he took charge of the court school there. From about 796 he was abbot of St. Martin at Tours, and there he reorganized the scriptorium. Under him, and under houses working the same way, a new script settled into general use. We call it Caroline minuscule, or Carolingian minuscule. It was built to be read rather than admired, and that turned out to matter enormously. It still matters to you tonight, and I will show you why. Consider what it changed. Words were separated by spaces. Punctuation became more regular. There was a settled relationship between capital letters and small ones. Earlier Latin was often written as a continuous run of letters, and reading it meant sounding it out aloud. Word spacing had been developed in particular by Irish and English scribes who were writing Latin as a foreign language. They needed the gaps more than native speakers did. That practical fix is one reason you can read at speed at all. Look at any printed page near you, and you are looking at the result. Our lower-case letters descend from that script, whose shapes were revived centuries later by Italian scholars who believed they were copying ancient Roman writing. They were copying Charlemagne's scribes instead. The letters on the screen you set down tonight came out of monastery workshops of the 8th and 9th centuries. Not as a metaphor, as a direct line of copying, hand to hand, punch to type to pixel. The numbers here are worth holding on to. More than 7,000 manuscripts survive from the 8th and 9th centuries alone. That is what remains, not what was made, and behind those 7,000 stand houses whose names you may never have heard. Fulda, St. Gall, Corby, Tours, each was a workshop with a room of desks, a stock of skins, and a queue of books waiting to be copied. They were, in a real sense, the publishing industry of their world. Most of the Latin classical authors you can read today reach us through those rooms: Virgil, Cicero, Lucan, Orosius, Pliny the Elder. Their works came down in copies made by monks with no particular stake in Roman poetry or Roman politics. For many ancient texts, the oldest copy we possess is a Carolingian one. The Roman original is gone entirely, and so is every copy in between. In places the chain narrows to a single surviving manuscript. Pull that one link out, and the author is lost. Now the other side of the ledger. Parchment was expensive and it was reusable, so monks reused it. An old book could be scraped and washed and written over. What you get is called a palimpsest. The first text does not vanish completely. It stays in the skin as a faint shadow under the new writing, sometimes for 800 years. Modern imaging can bring it back. So can patient eyes and good light. Some of what we have recovered was destroyed on purpose by the people who saved the sheet. In 1819, a scholar named Angelo Mai was working in the Vatican Library. He was examining a manuscript that had come from the Abbey of Bobbio in northern Italy, and on the surface it was a copy of Augustine on the Psalms. Underneath, in the erased layer, he found something else entirely. It was a lost portion of Cicero's work on the state, De Republica, unread by anyone for centuries. A text that had gone missing from the world was lying under a book about the Psalms. The other case is stranger still. A Greek priest named John Muronus finished a prayer book in Jerusalem in 1229. He wrote it across pages he had erased, taking apart older volumes to get the material. In 1906, the Danish scholar Johan Heiberg examined that prayer book and identified the undertext. It was the work of Archimedes, including treatises that survive nowhere else on earth. Somebody destroyed one book in order to make another. Both of them came through, and only by accident. You have the mathematics because a priest needed cheap parchment. Take the whole of that and put it in one line. Every old text you have ever read came down a chain of hands like this. Each link was one person at a desk. Not an institution, not a culture, not a movement. A person with cramp in the fingers and a candle burning down. A few of them are named in the record, but the great majority left no name at all, and we will never recover them. They are present anyway, in the plain fact that you can read the thing. Which brings us back to the one book that never told us anything about itself. Everything we have covered tonight is the machinery of attribution. Names in colophons, dedication pages, house styles, the trail of a book from one library to the next. You have watched that machinery work all through this chapter. That machinery is how we know Ceolfrith sent his Bible south. And how de Rossi got the credit back. It failed completely with the Book of Kells. Not one name, not one place, not one date. So we go back now to the object itself, start with the night it was stolen. The Annals of Ulster record the theft under the year 1007. They call it the Great Gospel of Columcille, and they call it the chief relic of the Western world. It was taken at night from the western sacristy of the great stone church at St Anna's. That is Kells. The hour was as dark then as yours is now. This entry is the first mention of the book that we can be sure of, which is worth pausing on. The first time it enters the written record, it is being carried off by a thief. It was found again after 2 months and 20 nights. The annals say it was recovered from under a sod, which means buried in turf. Its gold had been taken off it. That gold was the shrine, or the ornamented binding that had covered the book. Nobody has seen that metalwork since. It was almost certainly melted down within days and turned into something with nobody's name on it. The thief wanted the case, not the contents. He made a judgment about value that you would not make. The book paid for that night. Something in the region of 30 folios are thought to have been lost around that time. Whether they were torn off during the theft, or ruined in the ground, or damaged after the recovery, we do not know. What you can look at today in Dublin is what the thief left behind. Hold that up for a moment. The most famous illuminated manuscript in the world survives because it was the part somebody did not want. The losses did not stop there. Roughly 340 folios survive of what was perhaps 370. Leaves are missing after folio 177. More are missing after folio 239 and after folio 330. The Gospel of John breaks off partway through and never resumes. The book simply stops mid-text. Somewhere across 1,000 years those pages were separated from it, and not one of them has ever turned up. What you can see in Dublin is an incomplete object. Then there is the damage done by care. In the 19th century a binder trimmed the pages to square them up, and his knife went into the edges of the illumination. Ornament that ran to the margin was cut through, and part of it is gone permanently. No technique we have can put it back. A rebinding in 1895 failed quickly as well. By the 1920s some of the leaves had come away from the binding entirely and were loose. That is within your grandparents' lifetimes, not the deep past. It is worth being plain about this. More of the Book of Kells has been lost to handling, storage and repair than to any raid. The same is true of a great many medieval manuscripts. Dramatic threats make the stories that get told. The undramatic ones do most of the actual damage. A book can survive fire and theft and burial and still lose its margins to a well-meaning craftsman with a sharp blade and a straight edge. You will not find a villain in that part of the story. Now the sequence that kept it alive. In 1654, during Cromwell's occupation of Ireland, the book was sent to Dublin for safety, because Kells was not a secure place to keep anything at that point. In 1661 a bishop named Henry Jones presented it to Trinity College, Dublin. It has stayed there ever since, which is more than 350 years in one institution. That move was administrative and unromantic, and it is the reason you are able to see the book at all. In 1953 a binder named Roger Powell was given the job of rebinding it. He took it into 4 volumes, one for each gospel, and flattened pages that had developed bulges over the centuries, working sheet by sheet with damp and pressure. The work took him years. Splitting the book into 4 is the reason 2 openings can be shown at the same time. If you have stood in front of the case in Dublin, that is why there were 2. So what do we actually know about it now, after all that effort? The materials are settled. It is calf vellum prepared by hand. There is no gold leaf anywhere in it, whatever your eye tells you. There is no lapis lazuli either. The blue is indigo. The yellow is orpiment, which is an arsenic compound. There is red lead, and there is verdigris. And in places the verdigris has damaged the vellum underneath it. All of that is measurable, and it has been measured. Everything else remains open. We do not know who made it. We do not know where it was made. Scholars have argued for Iona, for Kells, for both together and for other houses entirely, and the question is still disputed. We do not know the date beyond a broad window around the year 800. We do not know who it was made for or what occasion it was meant to serve, and we do not know why the work stopped. That last one is the question I want to leave with you. Go back with me to the unfinished pages. There are places in the manuscript where the drawing is complete and the colour never arrived. The outline is there, ruled and inked and confident. The spaces inside it are bare vellum. Whoever drew those shapes fully intended to fill them. On some folios the work halts in the middle of a panel. The hand that was doing it put the brush down, and as far as the page is concerned, it never picked the brush up again. You are looking at an interruption, held still. We have theories about that. A raid, a death, a move to another house, a patron who stopped paying, a workshop that ran out of pigment or ran out of time. Each is plausible, and not one of them is proved. The page cannot tell us which. This is the honest position, and I would rather give you that than a tidy story. We do not have an answer. Those blank spaces are the last thing the makers left us, and it is not a message they meant to send. Here is what I think you can take from it. What survives of most people is not their names. It is their work, detached from them and carrying on without a label. That is not a sad fact when you look at it directly. It is the ordinary condition of almost everyone who has ever lived. The men in that scriptorium are anonymous in the fullest sense, and their book sits behind glass in Dublin with a queue of people in front of it. Think about what the book actually is, underneath the fame. It is a record of thousands of ordinary working hours. Cold rooms. Poor light. Winter days that gave only a few usable hours at the desk. Skins prepared months in advance. Pigments ground, mixed and tested. A page ruled before a single word went onto it. None of that feels remarkable while you are doing it. It is a job done at a desk for years by people whose hands hurt. The marks of those hands are still on the page. Ruling lines run under the text where a scribe scored the vellum before writing. Prick marks along the edges show where he measured out the spacing. There are holes in the skin, flaws from the animal itself, and the writing goes around them rather than waste the sheet. You can find places where a scribe misjudged his line and crowded the last few letters together to make them fit. There are corrections, and letters written in above the line where something had been left out. There are places where the ink changes shade because a fresh batch was mixed. On some pages the writing grows larger towards the foot, which is what a tired hand tends to do. None of that was made for you to see. It is the residue of the job left on the page because there was no way to take it off. That is the closest you will ever get to them. Not a name, not a face, not one word about themselves. A crowded line ending and a hole in a skin that somebody wrote around 1200 years ago. Those small decisions were made in a few seconds by a person who expected nobody to notice. You are noticing them now, in the dark, at this hour. It is a strange kind of contact, and it is the only kind on offer. So the mystery stays exactly where it started. Nobody knows who made the Book of Kells. Nobody knows for certain where it was made. Nobody knows why several of its pages were left unfinished. It carries no colophon, and it names nobody at all. After 2 centuries of scholarship, with everything from art history to Raman spectroscopy brought to bear on it, those questions are still open. I do not expect them to close. The book has been asked, repeatedly and carefully, and it does not answer. And still it is here. 340 leaves of calfskin, written and painted by hand, carried off an island under attack, buried in a field by a thief, trimmed by a binder, rebound in 4 volumes and set in a case in Dublin. It has outlived every person who touched it, and every institution that owned it, and it will outlive you and me both. That is a plain statement of fact rather than a consolation, and I think it is better for being plain. Wherever you are, it is late now. The room around you is dark and quiet, and this is the hour when most of the work of the world has stopped. The men who made that book knew this hour well. They rose in it, in rooms colder than yours, and their day began before there was any light to see by. It began with reading. That is a thin and real thread between the place where you are lying and the place where they were standing. Hold on to the small things rather than the grand ones. Ruling lines. Prick marks. Letters crowded at the end of a line to make them fit, a brush set down on a bench and not taken up again. That is what 1,000 years leaves of a person, and it turned out to be enough to keep. Your own hours are being spent the same way, one at a time, on work that will outlast the memory of who did it. The book is in Dublin tonight, under glass, with the lights off and the doors locked. It has been through worse nights than this one. In the morning somebody will turn a page in it, carefully, the way it has been turned for 1,200 years. It is your turn to sleep now. Thank you for staying with me through all of it. Sleep well now. I hope the night is a gentle one.